and then sat down behind him and was alone in the room with him throughout this momentous speech.
War is often told through battles and generals, yet the deepest wounds are carried by civilians. And in World War II, it was Italian women who endured horrors so savage they remain almost unspeakable. The Battle of Monte Cassino was supposed to symbolize liberation. Instead, it became infamous for a nightmare the locals still call the Moroccan Night. Allied troops, celebrated as heroes, turned into predators when the sun went down. We uncover the buried truth, who the perpetrators were, what they did, the voices of survivors, and why silence has lasted for decades. Prepare for history's darkest chapter. From victory to infamy. When people remember World War II in Italy, they often picture brave Allied forces pushing their way toward Rome, fighting to free a nation under Nazi rule. And nowhere was the struggle more intense than at Monte Cassino. Rising steeply in the Lazio region, crowned by a centuries-old Benedictine abbey, Monte Cassino was the gateway to Rome. But in 1944, it also became the stage for one of the darkest and least discussed tragedies of the war. The battle itself was unlike most. Instead of a single clash, Monte Cassino was fought in 4 brutal phases between January and May of 1944. The Allies desperately needed to break through the German defensive line, the so-called Gustav Line, that blocked the road to Rome. German forces, deeply entrenched in the mountains, had turned the abbey and the surrounding valleys into a fortress. For months, they held back waves of Allied troops, inflicting devastating casualties. Thousands died on both sides, while Italian civilians trapped in the region faced bombardments, starvation, and displacement. On February 15, 1944, the Allies controversially decided to bomb the Benedictine Abbey at Monte Cassino with hundreds of tons of explosives. The abbey, a holy place dating from the 6th century, was leveled to the ground. The attack was meant to flush the Germans out, but the ruins instead became a highly fortified defensive position for them. For many Italians, it stood as proof that the war knew no bounds. Not even those of sacred places could save them from destruction. The fighting dragged on for months. American, British, Polish, New Zealand, Indian, and French troops took turns launching assaults. Whole divisions were ground away in the mud and mountains, while the Germans refused to yield. By spring, both sides were starting to feel the effects of exhaustion. But the Allies knew that whoever won here had a say in whether Rome lived or died. The French Expeditionary Corps comes into the picture under the command of General Alphonse Juin. A seasoned army veteran, sharp in mind and aggressive in action, he brought along one of the most unique and feared forces of the war, the Moroccan Goumiers. These North African soldiers were masters of mountain warfare, best suited to the rugged terrain which was holding the Allies stymied months on end. Under Juin, they would traverse impassable passes and launch night strikes. Their contribution literally broke key segments of the German line and finally opened the way to Rome. For many months of suffering, the Allied flags have flown high above the ruin of Monte Cassino. By May 18, 1944, the Germans were forced to retreat northwards, and, in a few weeks, the Eternal City too had been liberated. Military historians generally tend to describe the struggle as perhaps the most significant in the Italian campaign, a victory at a very heavy cost. But for the civilians in the region, the real nightmare was just beginning. After the ultimate weakening of German defense, General Juin said a few words to his men. Rather than restraining them, it can be said that he congratulated them for their bravery and promised them a reward. According to testimonies collected later, During this 50-hour period, Junius left those troops free to act, to take whatever they wanted from whomever they wanted without concern for punishment. This was a fateful decision, converting soldiers into predators, leaving civilians entirely defenseless. For the people of adjacent villages who had suffered through months of shelling and hunger, the departure of the Germans should have been a moment for relief. Instead, the end of the battle marked the beginning of an ordeal they would remember as the darkest of their lives. What ensued was not liberation, but an unprecedented storm of violence, savage in its intensity, that even Allied soldiers from other units recoiled in horror upon hearing the screams echoing across those valleys. The real war began when the soldiers turned their rage on the very people they were meant to save. Who were the Goumiers? To understand the terror that swept through central Italy in 1944, we first need to understand the men who carried it out. The Goumiers. These were not regular French soldiers in polished boots and pressed uniforms. The Goumiers were Moroccan irregulars, hardened fighters drawn from the mountains of North Africa, recruited by the French colonial administration and brought to Europe as part of the French Expeditionary Corps. The word Goumier comes from the Arabic goum, meaning to rise up or to stand. Originally, goum referred to tribal companies of horsemen used by the French in their colonial conquests in Morocco. By the time of World War II, however, the term had come to describe entire units of Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian fighters. Organized into groups known as tabors, each tabor was made up of several hundred men, led by French officers. In Italy, there were more than 7,000 Goumiers fighting under General Alphonse Juin. The Goumiers, much unlike other armies, painted the world with his reputation, which played between awe and terror. They are incredible mountain warriors in the battlefield. Their hardy upbringing in the splitting landscapes of the Atlas Mountain made them fitted against the very hazardous terrain of central Italy. The Goumiers moved with startling ease, scaling cliffs and flanking German positions. There were Allied tanks and artillery struggling in the steep ridges and narrow passes. They valued them for their ferocity and resilience, and Juin used them as shock troops in the hardest sectors of the front. In fact, their looks increased their esteem in the society. The Goumiers were not outfitted in the staid uniforms of the French army. They fought in rough woolen tunics, strapped rope sandals, and wrapped turban or fez-style caps. The dreaded jambia, a curved dagger dangling loosely from its belt, hung there with pride. Rumors circulated among civilians and other Allied soldiers that jambia were used to cut the ears or noses off fallen enemies, strung as trophies. True or exaggerated, such tales achieved a chilling aura around the men, establishing them as both respected fighters and objects of dread. Initially, however, even as they proved to be gallant soldiers in battle, much worse stories quickly evolved about them outside the battlefield. One of the infamous Goumiers, good friends but much more famous for their lack of concern when far from the front. Even in North Africa, French commanders had long been working to discipline these men, and the charge of looting, abuses, and excesses was frequent. Europe, beyond the walls of their country, and assured no charges for whatever they did, loosed their worst instincts. However, it is important to note that the Goumiers were not freelance mercenaries, living outside the official war machines of their countries. They were soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps, under French command and subject to the orders of the French generals. And, as General Juin opened the gates for them after Monte Cassino, he effectively erased military frontiers. The testimonies indicate he told them to do as they wished for about 50 hours without questions. It wasn't simply rogue soldiers, but from high, a top-down decision. Goumiers were not just feared by their enemies. American units in the area advanced side by side to the Goumiers with instructions to display strips of tape on their helmets at night to prevent being mistaken for Germans and possibly attacked by their erstwhile allies. This truly chilling command could only mirror the fear the Goumiers inspired in the hearts of Allied forces. By night, even the bravest allies could not help keeping their distance. For the civilians of central Italy, this fear turned into reality. After Monte Cassino, when the Goumiers entered the valleys, their behavior was far from that of an army. They were like a pack of conquerors. The Italians viewed it as almost surreal. While under German occupation, there could be some rules for brutality. With the Goumiers, there were none. Families were quickly learning that while under the Germans men hid, with the Laval Goumiers, women and daughters needed hiding too. But once their commanders looked the other way, these men unleashed violence that defied comprehension. A night when hell broke loose. The 18th of May, 1944, should have been remembered as the day the Germans were finally forced from Monte Cassino. For the people of the Lazio region, it should have meant the end of occupation, the return of freedom, and the beginning of peace. Instead, it marked the start of one of the darkest episodes in modern Italian history. A nightmare still whispered about under the name La Moroccan Night, or the Moroccan Night. After the German retreat, the Goumiers, emboldened by General Juin's words of reward and freedom, poured into the surrounding valleys and mountain villages. What unfolded over the next 50 hours was not a celebration of liberation, but a reign of terror. Eyewitnesses would later describe the soldiers moving like a flood, entering homes, dragging people from hiding places, and subjecting them to acts so violent and degrading that survivors struggled to speak of them even decades later. For the women of the region, the nightmare was immediate. Groups of Goumiers stormed into villages and hunted them down like prey. Young girls, mothers, and even grandmothers, some over 80 years old, were not spared. Victims were dragged from their families, assaulted in the streets, and brutalized in ways that defy description. Entire families were forced to watch as daughters, sisters, and wives were violated, powerless to stop the frenzy. Even children were not exempt. Cases were documented where little girls barely of school age were torn from their homes and subjected to unimaginable horrors. Men also underwent suffering. Those who tried to save their families were beaten, tortured, and slayings. Others were being humiliated and taken advantage by themselves. Some villages saw groups of men sodomized in public. It was a deliberate act of breaking the spirits of the community. Priests were special targets because they were seen as protectors of morality and authority. One parish priest who's trying to shield two young girls was tied to a post and savagely beaten, abused, and died from the injuries. Another had been crucified before his congregation as a grotesque parody of faith meant to terrify the survivors into silence. Such atrocities are unlike isolated crimes. They were actually part and parcel of a countrywide coordinated act of violence. Whole villages found themselves ensnared in the tempest. Reported the mayor of a town, the town of Esperia, with approximately 2,500 inhabitants, that within 2 days, 700 women suffered assault. Another village had 2 sisters submitting to the satisfaction of nearly 200 men. Yet another village had its women lined up, bounds placed on them, and assault began by soldiers who looked at these events as some dreadful competition. There was no end to the barbarity. Some women were mangled with knives and had their teeth broken so they could not fight back. Others were even in this case slain by the torment inflicted on their bodies. It was something that even Allied soldiers from other outfits took note of. American servicemen nearby reported hearing the cries of women echoing through the night. One member of a machine gun crew recalls, in an almost trance-like state, standing with his unit and listening to the screams coming from a neighboring village. When one sergeant asked whether the military personnel should intervene, they were told they had no orders to do so. Thus, the men continued listening, helpless, as the evidence of violence and suffering went on into dawn. And the nightmare wasn't a single incident. It spread through entire valleys, leaving no home untouched. Testimonies written in trauma. What makes the story of the Moroccan Night more than a grim statistic are the voices of those who endured it. The survivors, women, men, and even children, carried memories so horrific that many did not speak of them for decades. Those who did eventually testify left accounts that still chill the blood, painting a picture of suffering that words can scarcely capture. Many testimonies describe how the assaults happened openly, in broad daylight or under the moonlight, as if humiliation itself was part of the violence. One elderly woman recalled how she was dragged into a public square and forced to the ground while her neighbors watched in horror, powerless to intervene. Others spoke of girls being assaulted in front of their families, their cries for help silenced by the threat of guns or the sight of fathers beaten nearly to death for daring to resist. For these survivors, the trauma was not only physical, but also the unbearable shame of being violated before the eyes of their entire community. The brutality extended beyond women. In one testimony preserved by local associations, a man remembered how his brother tried to shield their mother from being taken away. The Goumiers responded by holding him down and assaulting him as punishment. Stories like his are rarely spoken aloud, even among victims, but they reveal the indiscriminate cruelty of the attacks. Violence was not limited by age, gender, or role. It was unleashed upon anyone within reach. For priests, however, some of the most harrowing accounts tell of Don Alberto Terry, who attempted to rescue two little girls from being carried off. For this bravery, he endured severe beatings, was tied to a post, and subjected to tortures until he died. Another cleric was crucified in his village, with his body displayed for maximum visible intimidation. Even the most hardened soldiers were shaken when they encountered accounts imbued with memories of such barbarity. To attack a priest, regarded as a shepherd to the community, was not merely violence. It was a calculated attack on the spirit of an entire people. With cruelty that sometimes bordered on the unimaginable, an entire platoon was made to take turns with two sisters within one village. Through it all, the suffering of the sisters was treated like sport. Meanwhile, in another village, a woman and her sister were tied up in public in the square, and alongside their families' tortured eyes, crucified. Survivors later recalled their screams penetrating the streets until they ceased. Through generations, these narratives birthed a very grim type of folklore, expanding on that fateful night when humanity itself seemed to have disappeared. Another coating of trauma was silence. Many women never spoke out about what they experienced for fear of education, rejection, or retaliation. In many cases, mothers would tell their daughters not to speak of what had happened, stressing that silence was safer than truth. Some survivors indeed admitted guilt for years, believing they had, somehow, failed to protect themselves or their loved ones. This silence has meant that innumerable cases now remain unrecorded, and the only source historians can draw upon to evaluate the extent of suffering is little fragments of the true scale of it. Yet some of these testimonies came, often many decades later, having found the strength or hastened by the urgency of age to speak with at least one of these emerging testimonies. One woman recalled watching soldiers rip earrings from a young girl's ears, tearing the flesh, and leaving her screaming on the ground. Another talked about her younger sister, sitting there, blood dripping down her legs, and their mother backing her to not say anything but pretend such was a cause. These testimonies prove that the violence fractures not only the bodies, but also the family and trust. But the human voices are only part of the horror. The numbers behind these attacks reveal the true scale, the chilling numbers of horror. Stories of suffering are always powerful, but when placed alongside the numbers, the true scale of the Moroccan Night becomes almost unfathomable. What happened in May 1944 was not a handful of isolated crimes. It was a mass atrocity spanning entire valleys, affecting tens of thousands of people, and leaving scars that statistics can only begin to describe. In the town of Esperia alone, out of a population of 2,500, the mayor reported that 700 women were assaulted in just 2 days. This figure is staggering, and yet it represents only one community among many. Across the entire region of Lazio, estimates vary, but historians believe that more than 7,000 civilians were taken advantage in the immediate aftermath of the battle. And that figure accounts only for those who reported what happened. The reality was far worse. Contemporary reports collected by Italian authorities and church officials suggested that there were over 20,000 documented cases of misconduct during those weeks. Yet even that number is deceptive. Social stigma, shame, and fear silenced countless victims, meaning the true total may have reached 40,000 or even 60,000 women. Survivors often admitted that they chose silence because they feared being branded, rejected, or even blamed by their families. Many never confessed what had happened until decades later. This hidden suffering makes it nearly impossible to calculate how many lives were truly shattered. Washing heaven under blood, men also die. It is estimated that as well over 800 men perished in wanton rampage, many beaten or executed for attempting to defend their families. Others tortured, mutilated, castrated, or publicly humiliated are usually left to die. The attacks on men don't show that the Moroccan Night was only lust or chaos, but proved it also was about domination and decimation of entire communities. Long after the soldiers had left, damage continued. Records of medical facilities for that period show some increase in the cases of venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea, and this fast-spreading recorded case spread due to the many assaults. In some villages, it was so bad that whole generations of females became infected. Later, it would be American penicillin arriving on the scene to save things from getting catastrophic. But for many of the survivors, it was not just the physical wounds but also permanent health problems. The number of pregnancies were also in the thousands. A lot of them ended in hidden pregnancy terminations, performed in secret by unskilled hands, whose results were often tragic. Others came to term, and from those assaults, hundreds of children were born. Most of these were given to orphanages by mothers who could not or would not bring them up as reminders of their trauma. Around 400 such children were just in one such orphanage in the town of Veroli in the year following the Moroccan Night. Most never lived to know their parents, embodiments of violence that their communities struggled to even acknowledge. While the tallies are shocking, they fail to capture the full magnitude of bereavement. Behind every number is a person, a family, a narrative cut short or twisted into silence. One victim could represent more than just a single assault, perhaps years of psychological torment, the collapse of a marriage, or generations of distrust passed on like an heirloom. Numbers can give us scope, but not the cries in the night, nor the shame that survivors learned to keep concealed within themselves for a lifetime. Yet, despite the staggering scale, those in power chose silence and denial. complicity and silence of authorities. What makes the Moroccan Night even more disturbing is not only the scale of the atrocities, but the way those in power responded. In theory, the Goumiers and the French Expeditionary Corps were part of the Allied Liberation Army, operating under rules of war and answerable to their commanders. In practice, the chain of command chose silence and complicity, burying accountability under layers of politics and denial. General Alphonse Juin, the man who led the French Expeditionary Corps, played a direct role in setting the stage for the violence. His speech to the Goumiers before the final push at Monte Cassino was remembered by soldiers and civilians alike. If they won the battle, they would be absolute masters for 50 hours. No one would ask questions. No one would punish them. Those words, whether intended as a reward or as reckless bravado, lit the fuse for a wave of crimes that would engulf entire villages. Survivors never forgot that it was not only the soldiers who were guilty, it was their commander who gave permission. General Charles de Gaulle, at the top of June, was leading the Free French forces. He has an awareness of the conduct of the Goumiers, but he does not move for meaningful action. The primary reason was that for him, France's image as a liberator of Europe outweighed ideas about the shame of crimes committed by its own troops. Punishment of the offenders or admission of responsibility would have sullied the heroic story that France was concocting for itself in the post-war period. Thus, the abominations were minimized, dismissed, or attributed to some undisciplined men. Uncommon alarm, the Vatican was unmoved. Reports reached to Pope Pius XII about women and children being brutalized by Allied soldiers. His unusual action was for the guests. He practically forbade colonial troops from coming into Rome during June 1944 after liberation. Not an empty order, was a direct admission from the highest religious authority that some Allied units had not been trusted to behave with basic humanity. For most Italians, this ban was like proof that what had really happened during the Monte Cassino siege was known, even if few dared to say so out loud. French military made a show of punishing a handful Goumiers, some executed as scapegoats. But those were gestures that could hardly compensate for the scale of the crimes. Tens of thousands of victims had not received any justice, recognition, or compensation. The silence was fortified by political convenience. Italy, free from fascism, did not want any of sour with France, its great ally in the post-war period into Europe. The Italian government did not want anything to say publicly on the atrocities, as it would fear diplomatic fallout. For decades after the war, France maintained an official line of denial and deflection. The crimes were usually presented as solely the work of North African troops, with a racist overlay that distracted from the white French soldiers' involvement. Yet British and Italian records affirm that many of the attacks were also committed by European Frenchmen. Thus, the French protected the idea that what happened was but the handiwork of a few undisciplined Moroccans, a convenient legend that allowed France to duck responsibility and smear its colonial soldiers. In truth, what retribution there was indiscriminate and not limited to troops of one nationality under French command. This selective memory implied European interests at the time. France wished to portray itself as the heroic liberator, not as an actor committing war crimes. A belated acknowledgement of what occurred at Monte Cassino would have contradicted this image. Italy was keen to gain closure following the years of fascism and occupation. The result was that the victims were voiceless, entangled into silence, enforced from both ends. For the victims, however, silence was not an option. Their scars demanded recognition. The fight for justice. The Moroccan Night of May 1944 left more than broken bodies and devastated villages. It left an open wound in Italy's collective memory. For survivors, the violence was not something that ended when the soldiers left. It lingered in silence, in shame, and in the whispered stories passed down to children and grandchildren. This silence was not only personal, it was political. Both France and Italy had reasons to bury the truth, and so the survivors carried their burden in the shadows for decades. For many women, speaking out was almost impossible. In a society that valued female honor, victims of assault often felt that they would be judged rather than supported. Some families even discouraged women from admitting what had happened, fearing public humiliation. As a result, thousands of cases never appeared in official records. The weight of that silence shaped entire communities, where neighbors might know the truth, but never dared to speak it aloud. Trauma became part of the social fabric, invisible but omnipresent. From the silence lived memory. The memories of survivors are privately shared, and then these accounts emerge to the public with time. Formed and active were associations of civilian victims, determined to keep testimonies until they would have lost to time. Each testimony reveals not only the cruelties of those nights, but the resilience of those who lived through the events. Survivors of those events would rather fight deletion from and keep from being buried the Moroccan Night. For decades, the subject was avoided by the French government. With the help of their officials, the issue was deflected too, because according to them, these acts were perpetration of a few rogue soldiers, which involved the Moroccan Goumiers most of the time, while they ignored French nationals. The same attitude was found in Italy, where it avoided confrontation as much as possible to avoid straining its post-war relations. The outcome was decades of denial, with the victims having no one to listen to them and no avenue to pursue justice. But there were small cracks in this denial. In 2004, 60 years after the events, the president of an association of Moroccan veterans, Ahmed Ben Rallal, made a public apology for the events occurring at Monte Cassino. This gesture was firsthand, an acknowledgement that the survivors did not imagine suffering and that the criminals committing such atrocities were part of him. It came to be a little validation with the Italians, but it showed further that the act was glaringly absent from the French government, which still has not formally accepted any responsibility or offered compensation. The legacy of the Moroccan Night truly lives on, not just through survivor narratives, but also through generations that followed. Children born from the assaults often grew up in orphanages, the very places with an unending memory of violence. Many never really met their true parents and grew up with questions regarding their identities. Others were raised by mothers who struggled to balance their love for their child with the trauma of their conception. These children, now quite aged, were living witnesses to a crime buried by nations. Historians and truth-seekers will not give in. They argue that the Moroccan Night was not just an unfortunate episode of war, but a historically enormous crime never to be erased from memory, like other crimes of the willful 20th century. There is evidence in the testimonies, documents, and medical records that support the scale and brutality of these attacks. To turn one's back is to allow a major injustice to remain unsolved. The story of what Italian women endured during World War II is one of betrayal and silence. The battle remembered for military victory also hides one of humanity's darkest crimes. If this story shocked you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Do you think governments should finally acknowledge and apologize for these atrocities? Share your thoughts below. And don't miss the video on screen now for more untold stories from the hidden corners of history.